Hey, welcome back to Storytime with me. The lighting's not getting any better. Which is kind of the reason it's taking so long to do this, because this is about as bright as it gets in my room in the day, and any other time there's just no lighting. And I'm getting around to buying a little desk lamp, but might as well do this now because you don't want to wait for that. So this is my little Dunedin house. Beautiful darling here. We've got our own little Storytime group happening in person now. Hi to all of the Storytime guys. Stuff and things. Sorry it's been so long. Hoping to do this now every Sunday. I've been here long enough. I'm sort of starting to get into a routine. Starting to get into a bit of a routine. Settling in. Oh my god, why didn't I live? Why didn't I move to Dunedin like fucking 6 years ago, 7 years ago, 8 years ago? Like, why did I waste so much of my life not in Dunedin? It's fucking brilliant here. So, that little babble. I suppose we'll get on to chapter 12, topical politics. Tropical politics, chapter 12. Oh god, if you knew how many times I've started this over the last 6 months. It cannot be more than about 700 miles from Iquitos to Lima as the crow flies. But to reach one from the other, the stretch of country which lies between the two towns is not the route that will be followed by the ordinary sane individual, much less by a body of troops. It means crossing the Andes by practically untrodden paths, and penetrating a belt of country infested with savage tribes, unmapped, and across a large part of which the only method of transport is by dugouts. And so it came about that, for all practical purposes, the authorities in Lima had no influence over events in Iquitos in those days. To send troops, for example, was a 6 months task from the day when an envoy left Iquitos to the day when the troops arrived. The double journey which had to be undertaken was, of course, about 9,000 miles each way, down the Amazon to Pará, down the Atlantic coast of the South American continent, around the Horn, and up the Pacific coast to Callao, the port of Lima. Cabling direct from Iquitos to anywhere was impossible because there was no cable laid. The only chance an envoy would have of getting into touch with Lima quickly was by communicating from Pará on his arrival there, or possibly from Manaus via Pará, if the line between the two places happened to be in working order. Owing to the shifting of the riverbed, this was seldom the case. And so it happened that the governorship of the province of Iquitos was not only a post of great personal responsibility, but also a very lucrative one. The governor was in charge, not only of the collection of the export tax on rubber and the natural product of the country, but also of the heavy duty charged on the merchandise imported to pay for those products. The whole system of trading hinged on the principle of credit, known locally as the aviador system. Goods necessary for rubber posts and the equipping of expeditions were advanced by the merchants to all comers, to be paid for at some future date in rubber. Basically all business was done by bartering in this way, there being very few cash transactions, and indeed very little cash to be had. Coin of all countries was taken at its face value, the pound being the recognised standard. This necessitated the importation of vast quantities of merchandise suitable for the Indians, such as trade guns, machetes, shirts and trousers of various colours and designs, canned goods, and a multitude of other things. The duties payable varied from day to day, and were charged at the highest rate possible. That is to say, at the highest rate which it was thought could be extorted from the individual merchant, the penalty for non-payment being the closing of the store, with a military guard to keep off would-be customers. In the absence of a civil police force, the town was under a kind of martial law controlled by the military, with the governor at their head. Bribery and corruption were rife, and each successive governor strove to make his fortune more quickly than his predecessors. Catch as catch can was the order of the day, with the inexhaustible supply of rubber on the one hand and the undying demand for it by the civilized world on the other. Every ambitious freelance had his eye on the governorship. One day, shortly after a change of governors had taken place, a boatload of some 50 ruffians recruited from the outlaws in the rubber camps, headed by the pretender to the coveted post, came upriver and anchored below the town. During the midday siesta, they landed and proceeded to the barracks. Most of the garrison, of about an equal number, were asleep or out in the streets chasing domestic hogs, which roamed at random throughout the town and became such a nuisance that they were the governor's decree liable to capture by anyone who would rid the streets of them. It was an easy matter, therefore, to take possession of the barracks, swear in the former government's guard, find the governor himself, chase him into the open street, and shoot him down as he ran. His successor, however, in his anxiety to make his fortune in record time, exceeded the speed limit. By informing the merchants that in all their recent importations they had paid duty to the wrong man, and requesting them to make a second payment, he alienated the sympathies of the community at one fell swoop. But, curiously enough, the money was paid owing to lack of organisation on the part of the traders. The success of the coup inspired yet another adventurer to try his hand at the same game. By a similar stroke, he obtained possession of the reins of power, eliminating the governor in the usual way. But when it came to the collecting of the duty for the third time on the same goods, he found that this was more than the trading community would stand. It began to be whispered that it was time something was done. The first thing was to find the man who would organise and lead the counterattack. This is where Solomon Cassez, Moroccan Jew and ex-warrant officer of the British Army, came to the fore. A prominent merchant himself, he was in addition a good soldier. Under his command, a foreign legion was formed to protest, in the only way understood in Iquitos, against organised robbery on the part of self-constituted authorities. Those of the population who were not already in possession of firearms were equipped by Wesh & Co., the largest firm of merchants in the town, and a force of some 300 men was fitted out. The foreign population consisted of a large number of Brazilians and Portuguese, some 20 or 30 Frenchmen, twice as many Germans, about 30 Englishmen, 13 Americans, and a sprinkling of the citizens of the neighbouring republics. They were nearly all overseers of the rubber camps, captains and engineers of the small privately owned steamers, or members of the staffs of the business houses. And so one day, in broad daylight, the force, to which all our party, except Ambusha, belonged, formed up in front of Wesh's store and marched down to the barracks. There was, of course, no resistance. A few minutes' talk with the sentries convinced them that the wisest thing they could do was to disappear. The governor was sent downriver in the first available boat. The Foreign Legion took over control of the customs, etc., and sent word to the governor of Lima that they were preserving order until such time as a properly constituted government authority should arrive. And so everybody once more allowed their shirt-tails to hang loose over their breeches, pulled their socks up over their trousers, and returned to the normal day's work of receiving canoe and raft loads of rubber, distributing merchandise in exchange, and taking their money from the rubber collectors, who spent a few days in the town before going back over, perhaps, the 200 or 300 miles of wild country which separated them from their stations. There was method in the apparent madness of this style of dress, a fashion which had been introduced by myself a few weeks before, which was universally adopted, being named by the natives La Moda Inglesa. Its advantages lay, as far as the socks were concerned, in the protection which it gave against the attacks of jiggers. These were creatures something like ticks, only more vicious, which lived in the grass and weeds of the streets. There were nihuas, which are exceedingly small but potent insects which make their home under the toenails and there lay numerous eggs. A dwarf ant, which attacks the legs, garrapatas, common ticks, and other local pests. And as for the method of wearing the shirt, this was just conducive to coolness and freedom of movement. So Iquitos settled down then to its red pepper, rice, beans, bananas, and paichi. These 5 staple articles of food form the principal diet of all who live in that district, almost to the exclusion of anything else except imported luxuries, such as canned goods. Of the latter, there was in Iquitos as good a supply of the best quality goods from all quarters of the world as you could find in New York. A man with a taste for delicacies could enjoy himself. I've referred to red pepper as a staple article of food, which is no stretch of the imagination. Every table had its dish of raw peppers, which were consumed ravenously, although one would suffice to choke the average man. Besides, the ever-present kudi uchu sauce, and quechua, that's golden pepper, composed of equal parts of these peppers, onions, and grease. This sauce was used to efface the flavour of every dish which is served up, all losing in their individuality under the influence of this all-powerful weed, which grows in immense profusion everywhere in the Amazon basin. One night, as we were sitting in the hotel discussing ways and means of getting up the Amazon towards our goal, in walked a tapir, a reminder of the old Yasuni days. I found out that it lived between the hotel and the restaurants across the way, begging for tidbits from the guests at the tables. Among the other domestic pets of Iquitos, by the way, was an anteater, which was as tame as a lapdog, but which confined itself to its natural diet of ants and was, by the same token, a welcome visitor wherever it went, except at my table, where, for obvious reasons, it took the edge off Jack's and my appetite. It may be mentioned at this point that our number was completed by two Peruvians, known as Eurico and Pedro. The former was a trader who was in Iquitos at the time by chance, and whose acquaintance with ourselves led to his offering to join our expedition. The latter was a carpenter who had come down from the interior attracted by the prospects of profitable business in this new and flourishing trading centre, where wages were at a high level. As for the equipment of the expedition, we started off by buying stores of all kinds, but very soon discovered that it was unnecessary to involve ourselves in further expenditure, as all the business houses were only too anxious to aid us in our venture, in the hope of being favoured with our confidence should we meet with any notable success. Some of our first stores purchased were hardtack and corned beef, which we found we could procure from the steward of a Liverpool boat, which was anchored offshore. There was a certain air of mystery about the transaction, for the completion of which we were told to put off at 1 o'clock in the morning in a dugout. We were to be met on the port side by the steward, with the barrels ready slung over the side. Silence was, for obvious reasons, to play an important part in the operation, it being extremely desirable not to disturb either the ship's officers or the customs lookouts on shore. We were successful in one, but not in the other. On approaching the vessel in the swift current, we swung round, dropped a paddle in the canoe's bottom, and fetched up with a bang against the side of the steamer. Then, in lowering the first barrel into the canoe, those who handled the ropes let go too soon, and besides creating considerable noise and confusion, nearly sank our craft. While they were lowering the second barrel, the captain walked out to the bridge in his pyjamas and surveyed the scene. To our astonishment, he never uttered a word. We completed the business in hand and pushed off for shore, making a successful landing below the town. The steward afterwards explained to us that the captain had not interfered as, although he, the steward, might have been in a compromising position, he had on previous occasions observed other and greater irregularities in which the skipper himself have been implicated. So with our kit complete, composed of what we'd collected in one way or another, we decided to make a start. Not for the first time, let it be said. Nearly 6 months had gone by since the night when Jack and I sold out for cash. It was now the middle of June 1899, and as far back as January, I was expecting to be able to get away, as I know from letters written home at the time. I have one dated 12th January, which I wrote to my brother-in-law, M.C. Arnott, which I expressed my disappointment at not getting off at the time I anticipated, and expected to leave the day after tomorrow. But at last, in June, it looked as if we were really ready. We had our arms and ammunition, shovels, picks and gold pans, one bivouac tent, cooking utensils, medical supplies, a complete set of tools for effecting repairs, spare clothes sealed in rubber bags, a banjo, Brazilian tobacco in long bars, half a dozen kegs of rum, 4 dogs, 1 city-bred animal, poor little beast, and concentrated canned foods which were chosen for their compactness. Here I must not fail to mention a decision which I took just before we started, for it had a most important influence on this record of my travels. I resolved to keep a diary, or at least some form of journal, to record my impressions of the Inca Gold expedition. Perhaps I felt a little regretful of having no record of the past 2 years, or perhaps it was merely a passing whim, the result of discovering some old pocketbook amongst my kit. I have forgotten of what the idea was born, but the travel-worn document itself I retain to this day. The last thing I did before leaving was to write and tell my family to send some letters to the American minister at Lima. I did not know which I should see first, the Pacific or the Atlantic. The first, somewhat laconic entry in my journal records our departure under the date of Friday, June 13th, 1899. Finally left Iquitos today after nearly 2 months of mañana. And so we say goodbye at last. Chog poncha kama Iquitos. Fuck, man. It took how long to get that chapter? That was such a short chapter. It took me how long to get that out? But cool. That is officially done. I am gonna rewatch this quickly, upload it, and then boom! Story time. Here. Same again next Sunday. So long then.